Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our second session of NACo's information session series on the American Rescue Plan's State and Local Fiscal Recovery Fund, the final rule that Treasury released just the other week. Today, we are going to focus on the broadband infrastructure section, go through the allowable uses of recovery funds, some key new features of the final rule, and differences between the final rule and the interim final rule. Today, I am joined by Seamus Dowdall, who is our legislative associate, and he handles our telecommunications and technology portfolio. So just before we get into the session itself, just a reminder for folks that are joining, if you do have questions, please put those in the questions box instead of the chat box. And after both myself and Seamus provide our overview of the final rule, we will get to those questions at the end. So to start off, I am just going to provide an overview of some of the key highlights of the final rule and then kick it over to Seamus, and he will go into the details of the broadband infrastructure section. So some of the key highlights included in the final rule. And again, this is for the $65.1 billion state and local fiscal recovery fund. So first highlight here is that the final rule is effective starting April 1st of 2022. However, counties do have the option to actually opt in and using the broadened flexibility under the final rule immediately if you choose to do so. However, you also have the option to continuing to operate under the interim final rule if you choose to do so. So if you would like to do that or operate under the final rule, it's your choice. So long as that you are in compliance with both the eligible uses under the interim final rule and final rule, your funds will not be recouped. The second key highlight and a very, very major provision included in the final rule that NACo was happy to see, and we worked with Treasury on this, is that now counties are allowed to allocate up to $10 million of their total ARP allocation towards lost revenue and use those funds for any sort of government service. This also allows you to do that $10 million standard allowance, and you no longer have to use the Treasury revenue loss formula. Also regarding revenue loss, there were improvements to the Treasury revenue loss formula. Specifically, it now includes 2 new revenue streams that the previous revenue formula did not include. Specifically, you can now include any sort of revenue loss with utility, as well as liquor store sales as well. And then I'll get into detail. There are a couple of other changes with the formula as well too, that were definitely improvements. In terms of the capital expenditures section within the final rule, what Treasury did is that they provided a lot of clarification in terms of eligible uses of funds for capital expenditures and ineligible, as well as some requirements associated with projects if you choose to invest your funds in that way. Then moving on to the negative economic impact section of the final rule, you may remember under the interim final rule, while you generally did have a lot of flexibility in terms of investing those funds, when you were serving populations within qualified census tracts or QCTs, you had even more flexibility in terms of the services and support that you could provide. So under the final rule, pretty much what it does is that Treasury just presumes certain households, businesses, or nonprofits were either impacted or disproportionately impacted. And then with that presumption, you can provide a wide range of services to your residents. Then around premium pay, simply what the final rule does is that it expands the eligibility for which employees can receive premium pay, as well as streamlines that process in terms of administering premium pay to your employees. Then in terms of rehiring local government staff, you may remember under the interim final rule that you were allowed to use recovery funds to hire staff up to your pre-pandemic levels. So whatever your staff level was January 27th of 2020, when the public health emergency was declared. Now under the final rule, you can still rehire to those pre-pandemic levels, but you can actually hire up to 7.5% above your pre-pandemic baseline and use the recovery funds to cover those payroll expenses. I won't spend too much time on the next highlight. It's around cybersecurity, but there's broad and flexibility in terms of how you can use recovery funds to invest in cybersecurity, which Seamus will go into a lot of detail in just a few minutes. In terms of water and sewer infrastructure, also additional eligible projects. What Treasury did there is that they broadened the eligible projects beyond those included in the interim final rule, which were specifically projects under the EPA's Drinking Water State Revolving Fund and Clean Water State Revolving Fund. So now you can use recovery funds for culvert repair, dam and reservoir rehabilitation, as well as many other projects as well too. And then finally, the last piece is around broadband infrastructure investments, but Seamus will go into detail about that. So reporting requirements, before I move on to just a couple of other overview items, reporting requirements, this is very significant, of course, because the first project and expenditure report is due at the end of this month on January 31st of 2022. As a reminder, not all counties will be required to submit that report at the end of this month. This only applies to counties that have populations that exceed 250,000 residents or received more than $10 million in ARP recovery fund awards from Treasury. So your reports are due at the end of this month. And specifically your report will cover the period beginning March 3rd of 2021 to December 31st of 2022. And then for those of you that are not within either of those tiers, your reports are not due until April 30th of 2022, and Treasury will be releasing additional guidance specifically for those counties. So in terms of eligible categories, I think we all know this by now, but just as a refresher, there are 6 overarching categories that you can invest in: the public health response, addressing negative economic impacts, replacing lost revenue, providing premium pay, water and sewer infrastructure, and of course, broadband infrastructure, which we'll go into. So as Seamus is providing an overview of the broadband infrastructure section, it's very important to remember these kind of key items when we're talking about decoding the language of the guidance. You'll see throughout the final rule, there's a lot of should and must. So you should interpret these as mandatory reporting and compliance with the rule. There's also a lot of may and encouraged used in the final rule. So you should also know that this is more kind of up to the county discretion. It's just kind of the federal government preference, but it's not mandatory. And then finally, proportional and reasonable. Both of these words are also used a fair amount throughout the rule, especially proportional. So however you are investing the dollars into whatever service, program, et cetera, direct assistance to households, you name it, it has to be proportional to the negative economic impact that was experienced. So lost revenue, I do just want to highlight this before turning it over to Seamus, because we have received a lot of questions about this piece since it is so significant. So the key new features in the final rule. The first one, and I've talked a little bit about it already, is the new $10 million revenue loss allowance. Treasury refers to this as the standard allowance in the final rule. So again, you can allocate up to $10 million of your recovery funds toward lost revenue and use it for any sort of government service. So under this new provision, there are 2,137 counties, so 70% of the nation's counties, that are now eligible to invest the entirety of their recovery fund allocations for government services, again, without doing the Treasury revenue loss calculation. The other key feature is that if you are a county and you want to continue using the revenue loss formula, if you do have more revenue loss than $10 million, there are improvements to that revenue loss formula. So first, I mentioned earlier, you can now include utility revenue as well as liquor store revenue as well. Another big piece of this as well too is that rather than requiring counties to calculate their revenue loss December 31st of 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2023, what you'll be able to do is choose to either calculate your revenue loss on a fiscal year or calendar year basis. But whatever choice that you pick, you have to maintain it throughout the duration of the rest of the program when it ends in 2026. And then finally, another big piece of this is that the revenue growth rate originally that included in the revenue loss formula. Previously, it was 4.1%. Now that new data has been released, Treasury changed that revenue loss growth rate that you can compare your average revenue loss for the last 3 fiscal years prior to the pandemic. They changed it from 4.1 to 5.2%. And simply on this screen here, what Treasury does in the final rule is that it just outlines some examples of what are government services. So as you can see, a number of examples here: construction of schools or hospitals, road building and maintenance and other infrastructure, health services, and so on. But I do want to, I really do want to focus on the fact that these are just examples that Treasury provides, but make sure that everyone does know that you can use the funds beyond the items listed on this screen on the left side, and again, use it for any service traditionally provided by a government. The real only limitations that you have is that you cannot use the funds for rainy day funds, any sort of debt service, or distribute them extraordinary contributions into pension funds. So these are just key takeaways. Again, you now have 2 options to calculate your revenue loss: the $10 million ARP standard allowance, or continuing to use the updated revenue loss formula that Treasury provides. If your county in its interim report had reported $0 in the revenue loss category, which you were required to state how much your revenue loss was, you will have the opportunity to update your revenue loss either in the project and expenditure report that's due at the end of this month, or at the end of April as well. And finally, this is just outlining the remainder of the ineligible uses in terms of using revenue loss. So again, you cannot use the funds for extraordinary contributions to a pension fund, debt service payments, that includes tax anticipation notes or TANs, rainy day or reserve accounts, settle agreements, judgment, consent decree, or a judicially confirmed debt. And then these 2 last items are also added in the final rule. You also can't use recovery funds that conflict with any sort of COVID-19 mitigation strategies or practices that are in line with the CDC guidance currently put forward. And then you also cannot spend the funds that are in conflict with any sort of requirements under the uniform guidance, which the uniform guidance is included in Treasury's reporting requirements as well. So that's just a general overview of the rule itself, with an emphasis on that revenue loss replacement section. But now I will turn it over to Seamus, and he will go over all things broadband.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Erin, for that. And good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for being here today. So as Erin mentioned, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the broadband infrastructure portion of the Fiscal Recovery Funds program. As everyone knows, the statute indicates that broadband is one of the main infrastructure areas in which funds can be used. And with the release of the final rule by the Treasury Department, we found that there was a lot of broadened language around what is eligible broadband infrastructure investments. So I want to highlight a few key new features in the final rule first, and then we will go into all of the details. But first, I'll say that the final rule broadens broadband infrastructure flexibility. So under the interim final rule, counties were previously required to invest in households and businesses that did not have a reliable wireline connection at speeds of 25 megabytes per second download and 3 megabytes per second upload. With the release of the final rule, they actually elevated the speed minimum quite a bit to allow counties to invest in any location that does not have a reliable connection that is at 100 megabytes download and 20 megabytes upload. So this greatly expands the number of communities that will now be eligible for broadband infrastructure. And as I'll get into, there are even additional criteria that can be used to determine what communities can receive broadband infrastructure investments. Another key new feature I just want to highlight on this slide is that affordability is now included as a requirement for all projects that are completed. And what this essentially means, we'll go into the details, but projects must include an affordability option for any households or businesses that have an identified need for additional investment. Affordability was seen by the Treasury Department as equally essential to ensuring that broadband access is deployed into all those underserved communities. So I'll go into the details next, and I want to start with project identification and design. So the way that the final rule is written is again, counties are encouraged to prioritize projects that are serving locations that don't currently meet that threshold of 100 megabytes down and 20 megabytes upload speed. But beyond that threshold, counties now have broad flexibility to define additional communities that may need investment in broadband. And this includes lack of access to a reliable high-speed broadband connection, lack of affordable broadband, and lack of reliable service. So we'll touch on those points in a bit, but this is broad in language going beyond the simple speed requirements, and it gives counties a lot more flexibility to identify additional communities. In terms of designing your broadband project, so the Treasury Department did reaffirm in their final rule that projects are ultimately required to meet or exceed 100 megabytes symmetrical, so download and upload speeds meeting 100 megabytes per second. The Treasury Department also kept the flexibility for any communities or areas that, whether it be for geographical, topological, or cost restraints, can't meet that symmetrical requirement. And in that case, you do have the flexibility to build up to 100 megabytes download and 20 megabytes upload. You'll want to proof that project in a way where it is ultimately going to be able to be scaled to 100 symmetrical in the future. You'll see additionally below that bullet point that households and businesses with an identified need for additional broadband don't need to be the only ones that are served by any project that is approved under the Fiscal Recovery Funds program. So while it will certainly need to be a component, households and businesses that don't have that reliable connection will need to be served. You can certainly frame and pursue a project that serves a broader community, especially because oftentimes that can make projects more economical if you are reaching communities beyond just simply those that are unserved and you are kind of serving the broader community. And then I'll say lastly, and this is also notable and was expanded language under the final rule, that projects in broadband infrastructure and counties in particular can choose to consider any available data that they have for determining areas for investment. And this was quite interesting. The available data that projects could use could include everything from documentation of existing broadband internet performance to federal or state broadband databases, individual speed test results, interviews with community members and business owners. The list goes on, and essentially it highlights the flexibility that counties have in truly identifying what communities need investment. So moving on to the build to speed standards, I want to review some of the information here as well. And first, I'll start that once again, the projects do have that required speed, as we covered, of the symmetrical up and down at 100 megabytes with the flexibility in place. Below that, you'll see that fiber optic infrastructure was reaffirmed in the final rule as being encouraged to be prioritized in broadband infrastructure projects. Of course, as Aaron covered earlier in the presentation, encourage is a key word there. County discretion does remain, but the Treasury Department does highlight that technology as being a bit of the gold standard for a lot of different communities in terms of deploying broadband. You'll also see this section on reliability. So the Treasury Department made additional language that essentially says that any recipients pursuing projects should ensure that their broadband infrastructure provides reliable service. So going beyond what any provider assessment or advertised speeds may be, the connection ultimately does need to be reliable. There needs to be sufficient latency, and the speeds that are required by the program need to be sure to be met. And then lastly, middle mile infrastructure. So this came up quite a bit in the interim final rule in terms of guidance that was released. And essentially, the Treasury Department once more states that recipients are permitted to make investments in middle mile connections. The backbone is certainly an important component of deploying broadband to as many communities as possible. Treasury does state that they do continue to encourage recipients to focus on projects that will achieve that last mile connection as well. So actually connecting to households. But when you are building any of those projects, funded middle mile can be included. All right, so next I'll touch on that affordability piece. I mentioned earlier this was a key takeaway of the final rule. And there's some new language here to review. And the first is that for any project that is ultimately completed under the Fiscal Recovery Funds program, we'll need to have affordability program integration. So luckily, there's a bit of a mechanism in place for this already. So as many of you may know, with passage of the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act last November, was included in that bill the FCC's new Affordable Connectivity Program. This is available directly to all internet service providers. And essentially by signing up within that program, consumers would be able to receive a monthly benefit towards their internet bill of $30. And they would also receive a one-time benefit for a device purchase of up to $100. That program as a vehicle can be used for any broadband infrastructure program that is built using the Fiscal Recovery Funds program. Alternatively, providers could also have access to their own broad-based affordability program designed for low-income consumers. So there is that flexibility as well if a project is completed and they want to use something outside of the ACP. In addition to that integration, I will just mention, encouragements, right? More of that language in the final rule, and a few points here. The first, recipients are encouraged to consult with the community on the general affordability needs of the target markets that they're looking into. So that's an essential component. Affordability is certainly defined differently depending on where you are and where the broadband program and infrastructure is being deployed. So counties once more have the discretion to kind of seek the right data and make sure that they're providing truly affordable broadband access. And then similarly, so recipients are also encouraged to require that services provided by a broadband infrastructure project include at least one low-cost option that is not tied to any data usage caps and provides internet speeds that are sufficient for a household that may be in a constant or regular teleeducation setting, to cite a few examples from the final rule. And as a bit of a significant component of the affordability section here, there is a reporting requirement here. So recipients will be required to report the speed, pricing, and any data allowance information as a part of their regular reporting to Treasury. All right, so we've talked a lot about broadband infrastructure itself. I would be remiss not to quickly mention that broadband finds its way in a few other sections of the Fiscal Recovery Funds program, notably under the negative economic impact section. So there were two major takeaways here that relate, if not directly to broadband infrastructure, certainly to digital adoption and digital equity. So the first one here is aid to households and communities. So recipients are reminded under the final rule that anything from subsidies to households and communities that were impacted by the pandemic in terms of accessing the internet, to broadband adoption programs, digital literacy programs, and device programs are all eligible as a response to the public health emergency and also as a response to the negative economic impacts of the pandemic. So those are all eligible use of funds outside of infrastructure. Additionally, equipment costs, or what some refer to as the GAP network, was also addressed in the final rule. So services that are expanding internet access without constructing new networks are also an appropriate use of funds. So maybe these are subsidies once more for the cost of internet service, digital literacy programs, but also anything that provides devices and equipments in households. These could be tablets, Wi-Fi routers, computers that will allow households to effectively connect to the internet, are also eligible use of funds. And then lastly, I wanted to touch on a few more additional clarifications and really expansions that we saw with the final rule. So as some may recall, in the interim final rule, there was an emphasis or a priority to support broadband networks that are owned, operated, or affiliated with local governments, nonprofits, and cooperatives. This was reaffirmed in the final rule. So the Treasury does find that While counties, of course, have, and all recipients have discretion to support any broadband project that's going to meet that ultimate speed requirement and latency and reliability, there is an emphasis or an encouragement to support providers that are managed by local governments, as well as nonprofits and cooperatives. So that was good to see reaffirmed there. The Treasury Department also makes a comment on duplication of efforts and resources. So to the extent that recipients are considering deploying broadband in locations where there may already be existing federal or state funding commitments, all recipients will need to do is to ensure that recovery funds are designed to address an identified need for additional broadband investment. And that's really the key phrase right there, that identified need. In the interim final rule, it was a bit more limited in that we had a certain speed threshold, and any project that was being built could not duplicate another project that was saying it would meet that same speed requirement. But under the final rule, even if there is a state or federal funding commitment to meet the new speed requirements, there still may be an identified need for more affordable broadband access. There still may be a need for reliable access. So these are the additional criteria that Treasury lays out, and that's important for counties to know. Lastly here, cybersecurity. Aaron mentioned this earlier, but this was certainly a pretty large expansion. So under the final rule, counties are now allowed for modernization of cybersecurity for all existing and new broadband infrastructure. This is regardless of what current speeds may be delivered. And really this opens up cybersecurity as a general use under the Fiscal Recovery Funds program. You can, of course, still use modernization of hardware, software, different critical infrastructure within that revenue loss government services provision as well. But we've seen a pretty broad expansion. This is applied in a few different areas. I note broadband up here, but water and sewer infrastructure also have outlined uses for cybersecurity needs there. So this was certainly a pretty big expansion of the program. And then last clarification I wanted to touch on here is the use of funds to meet non-federal match under the IIJA, or the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. So the IIJA specifies under their BEAD program, that's one of their major broadband programs, that they require a contribution of not less than 25% of non-federal funds. But they further state that any matching contributions can include funds that were provided to recipients under ARPA. So this does include the Fiscal Recovery Funds program. And this was certainly exciting news. It's a sign of kind of the interagency partnership that's occurring between a lot of different federal agencies here in terms of broadband deployment and closing the digital divide. So the BEAD program itself, as some may know, and certainly this not the purpose of this webinar, but the BEAD program goes at first directly to states, but then ultimately sub-grant opportunities will be available. So it's notable to see that ARPA funds can be used as a non-federal match within that program. Perfect. So lastly, I just wanted to highlight a few county best practices that NACo has heard of and that we're highlighting on our state and local fiscal recovery fund resource hub. We encourage everybody to go on there and take a look if you'd like to browse additional plans, but I wanted to highlight a few related to broadband infrastructure. The first comes from Denton County, Texas. So in Denton County, they are allocating funds for a broadband project and needs assessment study, not student. Goals of the project are to deliver services to every household in Denton County, allow local providers in the community to purchase services for their area, create a system to ultimately deliver that speed requirement, so the 100 megabytes symmetrical, and then provide options to operate a co-op or nonprofit to distribute and manage the system. They're ultimately framing this as what they're calling a broadband backbone service project. So while they're still in the planning stages of the project, this is certainly one that could see both middle mile and last mile infrastructure. The second example comes from Summit County, Ohio. So in Summit County, they allocated $35 million for the county's broadband fiber ring expansion. and $25 million for community broadband grants to build off of that fiber ring. This project will ultimately connect 31 community governments as well as the county government. And each community will have the ability to build their own broadband networks and provide both internet and data services to everything from schools to libraries, businesses, and residents. In the ring, once more here, there's that emphasis on the backbone, and this will particularly benefit public safety communications network, which is a big benefit. And then lastly, Westmoreland County, Pennsylvania, the county here, and this is an example of cybersecurity investments. I suspect we'll likely hear of a lot more with the new guidance under the final rule, but the county here has allocated $277,000 to modernize cybersecurity and improve their critical infrastructure. And they've also allocated $344,000 for the purchase of a 5-year licensing agreement with Cisco Unified Connections to improve digital collaboration. So a lot of exciting new guidance here with broadband infrastructure. We'll certainly have more resources on this to come. And I think now we might turn over to a few questions.
Yeah, definitely. So yes, so now we'll open it up to a few questions from the audience, and just thank you, Seamus, for providing that great overview of all of the highlights in the final rule. So we did have a couple of questions come in. So one is from Julie DeMuth. She is asking, are there any restrictions around partnering with a private entity to build broadband infrastructure? Can the private entity own the infrastructure that is built with the ARP funds?
Yeah, so in terms of partnering, I'll say first that the Fiscal Recovery Funds Program, you are allowed to pool projects for regional projects. So that does include broadband. If you're looking to get into a collaborative project, that's permitted. You can also transfer funds if you're looking to provide a match of sorts to a provider. And there's no restrictions on working with a private provider versus a nonprofit or cooperative. Whatever the ultimate speeds come out of the broadband project, you'll want to ensure it just falls in line with the requirements.
Yeah, and this is kind of interesting. This is where like the decoding of the guidance comes in, right? Because in the final rule, it explicitly says Treasury encourages recipients to work with state, local governments, et cetera, but it's not required.
Exactly.
Yeah. And they do call that out explicitly in the final rule as well too. Treasury provides a response because many commenters did have language around private entities in the comments that they submitted regarding the interim final rule. Great. So another question that we have is from Tom Useless. He's asking, under the cybersecurity funding, can we use these funds to connect county locations or buildings with what would be county owned and used fiber?
Yes, so that would likely fall both under the broader eligible use for cybersecurity now, as well as the government services, particularly on the government services front, doubling down on critical infrastructure for county buildings, county fiber, pretty much everything that's connecting different county buildings that would be eligible under the program.
Great. And then the next question that we have is from Stephen Pasichow. And he is asking, can the county utilize broadband funds to upgrade its own broadband infrastructure for its facilities, or must it be only for the public and businesses?
So this again goes back. You want to keep in mind that your project does want to satisfy what would be an identified need for additional broadband investment. So the only thing I'll say there is certainly any households or businesses that are not currently being served with a sufficient connection would be eligible. But using that 100 down, 20 up kind of threshold for analyzing all broadband projects is a good starting point.
That's great. So another question that we've received a couple of times. So of course, there is a lot more additional flexibility in terms of how you can invest the funds for broadband infrastructure. But we've heard some counties are trying to invest in, outside of households, businesses, et cetera. What about if they want to invest funds for a broadband project that would support, like a private college or a community college of that sort? Yeah,
so in terms of really anything that falls under the it could be a community anchor institution. It could be different areas that may fall into the backbone of the middle mile of broadband projects to a degree. Once more, I'll say that likely is eligible because, as what many middle mile projects bring are the additional capacity for ultimate last mile connection as well. So you'll just want to be extra mindful there and make sure that if you are developing a project that may be going to a specific institution or location, that you want to justify the identified need using one of those three categories that we went through.
Great. So this question is a little bit more difficult, and we'll talk through it. But one question we received is from Andrew Keller. The question is, can you classify a broadband installer as a sub-recipient as opposed to a contractor, and thus not be subject to the federal procurement requirements? So
that is a good question.
Yes. So we can talk through it. So you start and then.
Yeah. So yeah, of course. So in terms of any project that requires a transfer of funds to a subrecipient, the initial recipient will continue to be required to monitor the program to make sure it falls under eligible uses. And I believe they will also need to be mindful of uniform guidance.
Yes.
I might rely on you a little bit more for details on the uniform guidance, but you will need to make sure that is the case for subrecipients as well.
You're exactly on point. Just to build off of Seamus's response, with the subrecipients, what we've been recommending and Treasury recommends themselves too. So you would still need to kind of follow those guidelines and navigate what the difference between the subrecipient and contractor would be. But in terms of the subrecipients, we encourage counties to set up some sort of contract with those subrecipients to make sure that they are fulfilling the reporting requirements set forth by Treasury, because ultimately the county is on the line if the subrecipient does not adequately report on how they are investing those dollars. And again, ultimately, it would be the county on the line if there is any sort of recoupment that ultimately happens. So, Seamus, I know you've mentioned this a couple of times before, but maybe just to hit the point home, we received another question from Adam Baca. It was regarding the Westmoreland County example that you talked through. And again, just maybe clarifying so folks know that you can use the funds for the modernization of cybersecurity and what the key differences between the interim final rule and final rule are.
Yeah, of course. So under the interim final rule, we'll start there. Cybersecurity modernization was pretty limited to provisioning government services. So in that language, they encouraged, modernizing hardware, software, different critical infrastructure, but it had to be tied to revenue loss. The difference now is the Treasury Department has categorized within much more broad use of the funds, any cybersecurity modernization project for new or existing broadband projects. This is regardless of current speed requirements. So if you do have infrastructure within the county that doesn't currently have cybersecurity infrastructure, you're looking to upgrade it, that is a good candidate for using funds for that purpose. And they're quite flexible.
That's great. And one last item, I think before we close it out, I guess two last items. So could you first, again, kind of talk through, because it was a really big change between the interim final rule and final rule in terms of Treasury encouraging recipients, counties to invest in households that didn't have that reliable wireline of the 25.3. Can you kind of go into more detail beyond the threshold that they provide, the 120? How does a county go about describing a community in need, and how do they have that flexibility to invest in those areas outside of that threshold? So I think that would be helpful to talk through kind of the other justifications for investing in those households and businesses, and then maybe just, well, I'll let you do that, and then I'll ask the final question.
Yeah, of course. So there are several ways that essentially counties can justify a project as meeting additional need. So, the first one, there is, of course, that speed requirement.
Mhm.
And because we've gone up from 25.3 to 120, just kind of by basis of speeds across the country, this will include a lot more communities, which is great. But there's a lot of flexibility outside of that. So lack of access to a reliable high-speed broadband connection, that's closely related to how recipients can pull data for determining areas for investment. So if you are looking to define another area as an identified need for broadband, and maybe you want to conduct user tests on the ground, you can do that. And if you find that speeds don't meet the requirement, you can report that and use funds for that purpose. The same applies to anything from interviewing community members or business owners. And if they specify that they don't have sufficient latency or internet to kind of conduct their telework or services, that may be an eligible area. And then there is the language around affordability and reliability that I think will greatly expand what you can include there. And in terms of affordability, program stipulations in the ACP, for example, may be helpful, looking at the FCC's program and seeing how they define affordable and then applying that here. But counties do have a lot of kind of flexibility there. The same thing goes for reliable service. There may be advertised speeds that demonstrate sufficient coverage, but the experience on the ground may differ. And if that is the case, that kind of opens up more opportunities.
That's great. That's very, very helpful. So I think in closing, maybe just a final, any sort of key pointers, key highlights. I know you've gone through everything very, very well, but any sort of key takeaways that you would like to offer the group?
Yeah, I guess what I'll say, and this is actually wasn't explicitly mentioned in the PowerPoint, but there is no pre-approval process necessary. The language is here and it's intended to be flexible for a reason. So if you're thinking about doing a broadband project, or if you are putting together the specifications and you want to refer to the language, definitely feel free to do so. But other than that, the Treasury Department encourages you to spend the funds to deploy broadband. So hopefully the expanded language here comes as good news. It certainly did for us. And yeah.
That's great. That's great. Well, thank you, Seamus, so much for your presentation.
Sure.
Thank you to everyone for joining us for this second information session. As a reminder for folks, we will be having our third information session next Monday, January 24th. That will be at 2:30 p.m. Eastern, and we will walk through the negative economic impact section of Treasury's interim final rule and go into detail around how you can provide support to impacted households, businesses, nonprofits, impacted industries, using the funds to rehire the public sector workforce, and so forth. So again, that's next Monday, the 24th at 2:30 p.m. Eastern. But thank you again, everyone, for joining us today, and we will see you soon. Take care.